Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of TMLS 2020. I'm Beta, an ML researcher and data scientist at Ryerson University. I'm honored to be your host for this session and introduce one of our great speakers, Rich Caruana. During the talk, if you have any question, post it in the chat section. I will make sure that at the end of the talk, we get back to all of them. Rich Caruana is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft. His focus is on intelligible, transparent modeling, machine learning for medical decision-making, deep learning, and computational ecology. Before joining Microsoft, Rich was on the faculty in computer science at Cornell at UCLA's Medical School and at CMU's Center for Learning and Discovery. And he obtained his PhD from CMU. His work on multitask learning helped create interest in a subfield of machine learning called transfer learning. Rich received an NSF Career Award in 2004, 2005, 2007, and 2013. He also co-chaired KDD in 2007. Without further ado, back to you, Rich.
Hi, thanks for the introduction and thanks for coming to the presentation. I'm Rich Caruana from Microsoft Research, and I'm going to talk about the risk of using black box models, especially in healthcare, and the importance of intelligibility when we're using AI for healthcare. Before I start, I just want to thank a bunch of people, in particular 5 great grad students, Yinlu Sarah Tan, Shuzo Zhang, Ben Lengrich, and Kingsley Chang, who have worked with me over the years on the work I'm going to describe. Let's jump right in. Brief history of machine learning. You know, perceptrons were all the rage in the 50s. K-nearest neighbor came into play in the 60s. Decision trees started to be popular in the 70s. Decision trees were still popular in the 80s, but we started to see neural nets rise. Then neural nets were very popular in the 90s, and we started statistical methods like Bayes nets and also things like SVMs. By around 2000, many people thought SVMs were the final answer to machine learning, but then things like boosted trees and random forests started to happen. And in fact, they supplanted SVMs as being the most popular learning methods. Then, of course, deep learning happened around 2000. And deep learning is very important. It's going to be here to stay. But it's interesting that most Kaggle competitions are still won by gradient boosted trees or random forests. Nets. Now that it's 2020, deep neural nets are definitely here to stay for a long time. They're very, very important. But it's an interesting question, what's going to be the best learning method that's most popular in the 20s on tabular data? And what we're seeing is that data scientists now want to use learning methods that are interpretable. And we think that one of the things that's going to be very popular in the next decade is going to be glass box machine learning methods that are designed to be interpretable. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. Now, you may have heard that the trade-off between accuracy and intelligibility, that is, the most accurate models aren't very intelligible, and the more intelligible models just aren't very accurate. And I'm happy to tell you that on tabular data where you know what each feature means, and that's a lot of medical data like blood pressure, heart rate, things like that, this is just usually not true, that there isn't this trade-off. And I'm going to tell you about this learning method called explainable boosting machines, EBMs, which is just as accurate on most data sets as boosted trees, forests, and neural nets. Sometimes it's even the most accurate model, and yet it's even more interpretable than things like logistic and linear regression and decision lists. So this is great that we have a learning method that now lets us sort of have our cake and eat it too, high accuracy and high intelligibility at the same time. Now, there's been a number of studies, I'm a co-author on 2 of the ones I'm going to show you here, that have compared these to other methods that are both interpretable and full complexity models. And if you notice, there's 10 data sets here. Average accuracy for EBMs is about 0.866. And if we go to full complexity models like random and gradient boosted trees, it turns out they don't do doing very, very well. By the way, 2 of my co-authors in this paper, Anna Goldenberg, they're here at the University of Toronto. Then this is a paper by Cynthia Rudin. I think you heard a talk from Cynthia about intelligible machine learning and the risk of using black box models. This is a study comparing EBM, and we win, I believe, 9 out of 12 of these comparisons. So they found, I believe, that we were the most accurate explainable method. And then they also note that the best methods that are explainable like us are also doing approximately as well as the best black box models. That is, there's no loss in accuracy for intelligibility. And then I just thought I would mention that we're also trying to bring the same sort of intelligibility that I'm going to show you to neural nets. So this is work that's a joint work with Hinton and Rashid Agarwal. By the way, Hinton and Rashid Agarwal both also here at Toronto. And this is work where we're trying to help neural nets learn that kind of interpretable functions so that the people who use neural nets instead of gradient boosted trees can get access to the same technology. Let me jump in and show you what this model class is, and then I'll show you a bunch of examples. It'll get much less abstract in a few slides. This is linear models, weight times a feature plus a weight times a feature, the sort of gold standard for intelligibility. And at the bottom here, accuracy but not intelligibility. It's just a function of all the available features. Think of that random forest boosted tree. There is something in between that's known as an additive model. So it's a function of the first feature plus another function of the second feature. So we have a separate function for each feature. Linear models are a special case of this where the function is multiplied by a weight. But here the functions can be much more complex. They could be multimodal, nonlinear. And that gives this class much richer representation power while still remaining interpretable. Now we can make this class a little more complex. This is the sum of all functions of individual features. So that's this line just represented as a summation. But we could, for example, do a sum of all functions of pairs of features or sums of functions of three-way combinations of features. And then this would be able to do pairwise interactions or three-way interactions. We're going to restrict ourselves to main effects, functions of individual features, and then a small number of the most important pairwise interactions. And we're going to restrict ourselves to this because it gives us high intelligibility, and then it'll turn out we can get high accuracy out of it. Now, we didn't invent these. Generalized additive models were invented at Stanford in the late 80s. This was Trevor Hastie's thesis. And they literally wrote the book on this in about 1990. But statisticians were pretty conservative when they fit these models. And because of that, they got less accuracy and it turns out less intelligibility out of them. Now, we can't be too harsh on statisticians. They didn't have huge data sets, big computing horsepower and all the tricks we have in machine learning now. Our contribution is going to be to put these GAMs on modern machine learning steroids. And in the process of doing that, we're going to get much higher accuracy. We're also going to improve the intelligibility, and we'll also be able to edit the models, as I'll show you. And we've also released a modern open source code for doing this, so it's now easy to train these models. So now I'm going to go through a number of examples just to show you what we can learn from these models. And apologies, some of you may have seen this pneumonia example before, but I'll start with that because it's a general introduction to how the models work. And then we'll go to other things that you may not have seen before, such as COVID-19. Okay, so this is a data set. It's very old, from 1989. It has 46 features in it. This model class is a function of a feature plus a function of a feature. So we're going to have 46 functions, one for each of the features. And then we'll throw in 10 of the most important pairwise interactions. So we'll actually have 56 functions in total. Now, this is what that might look like from a 30,000 foot view or a 10,000 meter view. So this is a function of age represented as a graph. This is a function of asthma represented as a graph, function of blood urea nitrogen represented as a graph. And the way you use this is you find the patient's axis, read off the Y value, which is the contribution to risk from their age. That might be a number like minus 0.23 or plus 0.5. These are log odds. You're going to end up with 56 numbers like this because we have 56 graphs in the model. And then you add all these numbers together. And here we're predicting probability of death from pneumonia. The more negative the sum of the numbers, the lower the risk of the patient. And the more positive, the higher the risk of the patient. So, and then it's just standard logistic regression on top of this. So it's 1 over 1 plus e to the minus sum of all those scores would be a probability of death. If this patient had a sum of scores of minus 0.78, their probability of death would actually be very high, about 30%. You really want to be a minus 2 or a minus 3. If this had been a linear model, by the way, the score would just be replaced with linear regression, an intercept plus weight times the first feature plus another weight times the second feature. But here we have a slightly more complex nonlinear model, and that's because we have a term that's coming from each of these graphs instead of being linear. Okay, I've zoomed in now on what the model has learned about risk as a function of age. And remember that up is higher risk and down is lower risk. And this is on a log scale. So this graph spans a range of about 1. That's very significant. That's an odds ratio of about E, of about 3 to 1. So there's a big difference between being at the top of this graph and the bottom of the graph in terms of risk, especially when you consider that these things are additive. If there's 56 such graphs, they're all going to add up or add down. Adding down is good for you. Let's see, the model has learned to predict that patients under 50 are all risk. It doesn't distinguish between people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, even though it could if it needed to. Risk goes up slowly as you go through your 50s into your 60s. There's an interesting rise in risk that's happening around 67, 68, 69. That's a retirement effect for this data from the US back in '89. Then risk goes up pretty rapidly as you become elderly, go through your 70s into your 80s. Surprising step function rise in risk right at 85, a very round number. Surprising flatness in risk to the upper 80s and 90s is a drop in risk that's happening around 100, 101. The rise in risk in 85, we're pretty sure that what this is doctors are just giving less aggressive care to patients who are considered very elderly, and the threshold they seem to be using is this round number 85. So back then, life expectancy might have been around 80. So people over 85 are considered very elderly, and we think they're just getting a little less aggressive for their pneumonia over 85 as opposed to less than 85. As in, grandpa's pretty elderly, he's got comorbidities. That's why grandpa's got pneumonia now. First round of antibiotics didn't help. Maybe we're not doing grandpa any favors by continuing to fight. Perhaps we should allow pneumonia to be the thing that takes grandpa out, because these other conditions are likely to do it soon anyway. So we think that's the explanation for why this step function rise in risk. It's a social behavior. It's not a policy law. It's certainly not biology. Your biology doesn't know you went around the sun, 84 versus 85 versus 86 times. We think this drop at 100 is exactly the same sort of social effect, but going in the other direction. Once you've made it to 100, if you've got something treatable like pneumonia, doctors just don't want to give up on you. That is, they're going to do everything they can if it's a treatable to get you past it. In some sense, they want to go for the record. So we think what's happening is patients over 100 are getting extra aggressive treatment, and the doctors are really doing everything they can to save the patients. They wouldn't do this with a terminal condition such as cancer, but it makes a lot of sense with a treatable condition like pneumonia to fight as hard as you can if you think there's a chance of saving the patient, and you really want to do that because they're 100. And by the way, when I give this presentation to doctors, invariably a doctor will come up to me afterwards and say, that's exactly right. When we have patients over 100 centenarians, we really do go that extra mile. Interesting thing about this model, now there's 56 graphs. I can't show you most of them. There's interesting detail like this on all of those graphs, so we can really understand exactly how the model has learned. The model really is these graphs. This is not some approximation of a more complex animal. This is the model, is a series of graphs. This model turns out to be the most accurate model anyone can set. So we've got this intelligibility without losing any accuracy. But we've also gained something else as well. So how many people think that we should actually predict that a 105-year-old is lower risk than a 95-year-old? I mean, we don't think that's true biologically because of the extra treatment that the people over 100 receive. So if we're going to use this model to predict your risk and decide what treatment you might get, if we predict your lower risk once you're over 100, then you might not get the aggressive treatment that in fact made you lower risk in the first place. So with this kind of model, we can redraw part of the graph. We can use an expertise to redraw the graph if they think we should. And then the model can make risk be monotone increasing above 85, and the model will do that. Now we have to be careful. When we do that, we're statistics in the data. But in this case, we believe we understand why the model learned to go deep, and we believe it's inappropriate given how we're going to use them. We're happy to overrule it. Now, the model's learned a number of surprising things. It has learned that asthma is good for you if you've got pneumonia. Chest pain and heart disease are both good for you if you've got pneumonia. And having an obstructed airway, having a kind of wheezing called stridor is good for you. And we think none of these are good for you. Doctors are confident these are not good for you if you've got pneumonia. And we think what's happening is the asthmatics notice the symptoms of pneumonia quickly, they get to care quickly, and they get very high quality care because they're considered higher risk. And that actually makes them lower risk because they get to care so quickly and such good care so fast that they're actually lower risk than non-asthmatics who didn't get to care quickly. Similarly, these patients, they think they might be having a heart attack, so they get to the ER very quickly if they're smart, and then quickly they know they're not having a heart attack, and they get very high quality care because of their history of heart disease. And the obstructed lungway, which causes this kind of wheezing, it turns out it's a symptom you can't ignore. Once you have this kind of wheezing, you will, because you and everyone around knows that you're high risk. Now, the interesting thing is none of these doctors tell us are true, so we can fix them all. One way to fix them is just redraw the graph so that they're horizontal, and now the benefit of asthma, heart disease, and stridor will go away. Or a doctor can actually tell us, no, the asthmatics are at elevated risk. I want the graph to go up. The heart disease, and I think the ones who have advanced pneumonia so that they now have an obstruction in their airway, they're at even the highest risk. So I want the risk to be quite high for that. So we can do that. The sort of thing that's interesting is the model, before we make these corrections, is actually getting high accuracy on the test set, and that's because the test set is just a random draw from our training set. So the model is being rewarded for predicting those wrong things, and accuracy will actually go down a little bit when we make these changes, and that's because the test set doesn't have these statistics in it. But we're confident that the model will be more reliable when we use it in the real world. Now, I just want to show you that we can learn a lot of good things with the data. Not everything needs to be corrected. So this is your blood urea nitrogen blood test all of us have had. And doctors really like this graph because they could see the effects of their treatment. At about 50, they start to give a med to patients. You can see risk goes flat. And at 100, they start to give dialysis to patients. And you can see risk actually starts to go down as more patients. So they really liked the graph, but they were concerned that the risk was already so high at 35 or 40 and thought maybe they should start giving the med earlier at 35 or 40. They were even more concerned that risk was lower for patients with a BUN of, say, 110 or 115 than for patients at 90 who were actually healthier patients, but who probably weren't getting dialysis. So with this sort of additive model, we can treat it like a spreadsheet, and we can conservatively draw the line, which is what we think the graph would look like if the treatment threshold for dialysis was moved down to, say, 85 or 90. And the space between the red line and the original curve, that's a mortality. So we estimate that just changing this one threshold for dialysis on this one blood test, BUN, just for one condition, pneumonia, in the United States, could save more than 2,500 lives. So it's amazing what you can learn from the data. Like here, we're just 50 and 100 are probably suboptimal, and doctors probably should be using something more like 40 and 85. Treatment effects all over in medical data. We see them on almost every graph, so they're all over the place. I'm going to skip the pairwise interactions just for the sake of time. If you saw the tutorial that I did earlier in the week, you can see that there. This is PF ratio, how well you're bloodstream. Low PF ratio is very high risk, but if you're healthy, you have a high PF ratio. And what's unusual is this bump that's happening right here. So what's going on there? It's not a round number, it turns out. It's happening at 323 in the graph, and it's not a round number in metric units either, so that's not it. It turns out the mean of this feature falls right here, and that's a very low. There were missing values in this data set. 60% of the patients, they didn't even bother to measure PF ratio because they looked good that way. And all of those patients were, before we got the data set, imputed with the mean, which falls right here. So we have 60% of the data, very healthy patients sitting right here, and the model has learned to go to low risk right there to represent that. Now that would be fine. The accuracy of the model is not really hurt by doing this, but there are some real patients who have a PF ratio of 323, and that's very, very bad. We don't want the model to predicting that to patients who really have a PF ratio of 323 are low risk. So we have to fix this by changing how we impute the missing values. Just another use of this model, we trained an EBM on this model. And it turns out it predicts that having HIV is one of the low risk reasons for being in the ICU. Whereas a popular calculator in the 80s predicts that having HIV is actually the highest risk reason you could be in the ICU. We asked doctors about this, and the doctor said, you know, what's happened is the MIMIC data is from 2005. By then, HIV is a very treatable chronic condition, whereas back in the 80s, when the SAPSII HIV was the kiss of death. There really were no treatments for it. So this difference in what the model is now learning versus what a popular model learned 30, 40 years ago is just because medical science has made advances. Okay, let me briefly talk about severe maternal morbidity. This is when something bad happens to a mother during delivery. And the usual risk factors that doctors will tell you are things like maternal hypertension, diabetes, the age of the mother, maternal BMI. We've thrown our EBM at this, and it tells us a completely different story. It turns out the two most important features are the one on the left is the weight of the baby, and the one on the right is the size of the mother, in this case measured as the height of the mother. So in a sense, the physics of birth is really the highest risk for a mother, which is that if you're having a large baby and you're a small mother, you're at very high risk. And that's because a large baby has to come out of a small pelvic opening. But at the other end of the scale, if you're having a small baby and you're a tall mother, then the mother is at much, much lower risk. And this led us to create a ratio, which is a sort of BMI for pregnancy. Normal BMI is the height of a person divided by their, it's the weight of a person divided by their height. This is going to be the weight of the baby divided by the mother's height squared. And it turns out this ratio, if we put it into our model, becomes the single most important feature in the model for predicting severe maternal morbidity. So this is a very interesting that we can think from the data. At first, the obstetrician actually didn't believe this, and then within a half an hour of seeing the model's detail, they became a strong believer in this. Let me talk a little bit about COVID-19 mortality, and then I'll wrap up. So this is COVID-19 mortality versus age. So in some ways, it's another respiratory illness like pneumonia. It's very similar to the pneumonia graph. You see there's a big flat spot here for risk, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s into the 50s. And then you see there are step function rise that happen at round numbers. The 55 is medically significant, 65 is medically significant, 70, we see a rise at 85, just one difference between what we saw before is there's no drop in risk happening at 100. And one of the reasons we're not seeing the drop in risk at 100 is many people who are this elderly who have COVID-19 and are in the hospital will be put on not only do not resuscitate, but do not intubate orders. So they're probably not receiving that super aggressive extra care that we would have given pneumonia patients because they're not considered to be as rescuable as the pneumonia patients. The other thing I want to point out is the vertical scale here is quite different. We saw on that pneumonia graph, the vertical difference between the top and bottom was about 0.8 max. Here we're talking about a difference that's 1.5 down to minus 0.4 or so. It's a difference of almost 2 points. And a log scale, that's an almost 10-to-1 odds ratio difference in risk. That's a huge deal. Okay, this is a gender, and as expected, we see that men are higher risk from COVID-19 than women. Once again, it's a pretty big difference that we don't usually see than women, especially when they're elderly. But we don't usually see this big of a difference. This is a difference of about 0.4 points. So this is almost a 40% increase in risk for COVID-19 patients for being male. Now, early on, we had a very low quality data set. This is in March, so the very early days of COVID-19 in the US at least. And in this data set, even though it's a very poor quality data set, we were able to sort of see a lot of the things that were later being talked about in the press, like chronic kidney disease is bad for you, diabetes is bad for you, hypertension is bad for you. But surprisingly, things like cancer and heart disease and COPD and asthma are not as bad for you. So we were able to see that in a very early model using a really crappy data set. We didn't publish this work because the data was so poor quality. But now we're working with hospitals in New York City to train these sorts of models on their data, and we're getting a lot more details. So I'll just mention one thing. I've turned this graph sideways to make it easier to read the labels. For example, platelet aggregation inhibitors, if you're taking this kind of med before you're admitted to the hospital, it turns out it lowers your risk. This is the low risk side of the graph. It lowers your risk of dying from COVID-19. And that's because one of the mechanisms of dying from COVID-19 is thrombosis. The other is a cytokine storm. And thrombosis is a blood clot. And it turns out if you're on platelet inhibitors because of other things you had before, hospitals, such as recurring heart disease, then it turns out that has a lasting benefit even when you're in the hospital because it tends to reduce your chances of getting a thrombotic event. And one of the first things they'll do for many patients get admitted to the hospital is they'll give them a really strong dose of anticoagulants. There are things on the other scale that we don't completely, like these proton pump inhibitors, that's a med intake, not to the risk. We actually don't believe this is because the med itself is adding to the risk. It's because the condition, the medical condition you have that caused you to be taking this medicine, we believe that medical condition is actually. So you have to be careful when you interpret these things. It's not just black and white, like if it looks good or bad, then that med is good or bad. It's often that the med is a sign of some other medical condition. Okay, this was our first discovery. We discovered this within a day or two of training a model on one of their data sets. So this is back in March, early April. Doctor said, you know, they expected that risk would go high with high lymphocytes. They did not understand or expect that risk would also go high for low lymphocytes. And they basically said, you know, I don't really think that's true. So in fact, we didn't follow up on it. However, since then, there have been a number of papers in the literature that have confirmed in COVID-19. So we wish we had followed up. We wish we had believed the model more and followed up on it at the time. We are studying lymphocytes more now, and one of the things we're looking at is steroids as one of the common treatments used for COVID-19. And what we think we're finding is that if you have low lymphocyte and high neutrophils, so that your neutrophil lymphocyte ratio is high, then we think we're seeing that steroids are very effective. But actually, if you have a normal NLR ratio, we think we're seeing that, in fact, steroids don't help at all. So this is good. So the intelligibility we're getting by training models on their data set, we think is helping us figure out how to better target meds at different kinds of patients to help COVID-19. So I'm just going to wrap up. Every data set, medical or otherwise, has these kinds of flaws. Every time we apply glass box machine learning to a new healthcare data set, we find these things. They're everywhere. High accuracy is not sufficient. Remember, the models are rewarded for predicting crazy things like that asthmatics with heart disease who have an obstructed lungway and who are 105 years old. It's rewarded for predicting that a patient who has all of those conditions is really low risk, and nothing could be further from the truth. And without intelligibility or some sort of explanation, you're really flying blind. And in healthcare, that's dangerous. So these EBMs give you the tools to vet and edit your model before you use it clinically. Also, I think they give you the ability to learn from your data and actually improve healthcare. These are currently the most accurate glass box learning method available. There's a very easy that we made public a couple of years ago. So you can now train these models very quickly and easily. And please, whatever you do, stop using linear and logistic regression in healthcare. They're such simple models that they'll actually lie to you. They'll tell you things that are false. And this really is just a generalization. GAMs are just a generalization of linear and logistic regression that can show you nonlinear effects, which are everywhere in your data. So you definitely should be using this sort of model instead so that your data can show you everything it's got inside of it. Okay, this is a pointer to the open source package. I encourage you to use it. And thank you very much. I'll stop there. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the talk, and I'm sure that the attendees enjoyed it too, because we get a lot of questions. And to start, the methods look to be generalizable to most domains. Does healthcare pose any additional set of explainability issues than other domains do not?
That's a great question. We see more treatment effects in healthcare. I mean, most healthcare data is after the patient is treated or while they're being treated. So that means everything we're doing to the patient is changing what their ultimate risk is. And you can have weird situations where you have a really effective treatment for something. So those patients actually will look like they're very low risk because the treatment is so effective. And then the models are going to learn that those patients are low risk unless it knows a lot of detail about the treatment that they're. So this is a really important extra challenge. And most of the editing that we do to the models is not because the models have made a mistake. It's that the models have learned true statistics, but some of the statistics have to do with treatment effects, and we don't want the model to be taking the treatment into account when predicting risk, because we might want to use the model's prediction to actually decide that the patient should get that treatment or should get more rapid treatment or more aggressive treatment. So healthcare has this extra special problem, which is that treatment effects are everywhere. Yeah, that happens in other domains as well, but it's much more prevalent in healthcare data. Great question.
And thank you so much. And by breaking down into the individual variables, is there a risk of confirmation bias in the explanations that you develop from the model?
It's an interesting question. So it's important, first of all, to know that a neural net, a random forest, a boosted tree is probably learning very similar things inside it. It's just learning it in a way that you can't see it. Like I assume, because the questions that are coming out of any accurate model are going to be incredibly correlated, and their accuracy is going to be very, very similar. So it turns out all strong models are learning something very similar inside. The difference about this kind of model is it's forced to decompose the learning into something that's interpretable. We can't see what's going on in the 10 million weights of the neural net, but in this kind of model, we can see exactly how it makes predictions. So it's not a case that it actually causes any additional problems in the model. If anything, it causes a simplicity that makes the model more appropriate. Confirmation bias in issues like that a little less likely because of the simplicity of the model. But any kind of problem you would have would exist in these other models. Now, I guess part of the question is, would a human looking at the graph, tend to believe it too much? We have some cases where the experts look at a graph and they say the right-hand side makes perfect sense. The left-hand side doesn't make any sense at all. For example, that happened with that lymphocyte graph. And in many of these cases, once the experts have gotten familiar with the model, detail. Like doctors were amazed that our model learned to go flat right at 50 on the Bunn graph and peaked right at 100 and then came down, because they said, wow, that's the thresholds we use for treatment for Bunn. It's amazing your model picked all that up. Once they get confident in the model, then they start to be willing to take even parts of the graph that they think are weird, that they don't understand, and put in more effort to try to understand, why did the model learn that? Do we need to fix it? Or in fact, is it trying to tell us something we don't know?
Thank you. I completely agree. And can you discuss or elaborate more on the feedback mechanism that you use once your models are put into practice to further optimize the model?
It's a really good question. Doctors do not want every time the model makes a prediction to suddenly have to look at 56 graphs. Right? Doctors don't have the time to do this sort of thing. So we tend to use the intelligibility, looking at the graphs the way we did in this presentation. We tend to use that in the early stages when we're first training a model on new data and we're trying to figure out what are the problems with the data set, because guarantee every data set has weird problems in it so we often use the intelligibility early on to try to figure out what's going on with the data, and then to figure out what the model has learned and how it needs to be edited. But then when we're making predictions that a doctor might actually use, or that someone in hospital staff might use clinically, then we're no longer surfacing any of this detail unless they ask for it. So we try to make it available if they want it. But for the most part, they actually would prefer to have seen this earlier, maybe in a talk, where they get to see a summary of the model so that they know if they should trust the model or not. And it's pretty rare that they would want to see this detail clinically for each patient, even though this model is very good at making explanations for each patient, when it makes a prediction. But typically, there just isn't the time, the bandwidth to want to go through the model that carefully. Now, if the model is making errors, we don't, hopefully there are feedback mechanisms where doctors can say the model really is doing something that I think is wrong, even though I don't know why. But that's up to a hospital information system to enable easy feedback on any sort of tool that is being used to help the doctors, so that they have some way of providing feedback. And then we can track those things. And because the model is intelligible, we can look into the model, see exactly where the patients are falling that the doctors are having problems with. Can try to figure out, oh, is that something we should have changed, or are the doctors wrong? Why did the data cause the model to, like, we can then do better detective work. But now we're focused into very narrow regions on a few of the graphs because healthcare providers have pointed us at something very specific.
Thank you. Is it fair to say that by construction, EBM would not be able to capture interactions between 3 or more features?
So right now, we almost always restrict it to main effects and pairwise interactions. Three-way interactions, the only problem with the code works for three-way interactions and higher. The problem is that are now a 4D graph, and it's hard for humans to wrap their head around a 4D graph. The surprising thing that we found is that the vast majority of data sets don't benefit at all from going to 3 and 4 and higher order interactions. That is, we really get 99.9% of everything we want, surprisingly, with main effects and with just pairwise interactions. We didn't anticipate that. We do know a few data sets where three-way interactions are important, and we understand why they're important in that data set, but we're actually really pleasantly surprised that we almost never need three-way and higher interactions. But you're right that right now the code, is written so that it won't go to three-way interactions unless you really force it to.
Thank
you so
much.
Need it, usually.
Yes, yeah. And can you elaborate, because I see this question a lot in the chat section. Can you elaborate more on why statisticians were too conservative in applying generalized additive models?
Right, so let's see. So statisticians, when they invented GAMs, by the way, GAMs are a brilliant invention. Statisticians are really smart people. They did it decades, earlier than most of machine learning. They fit the GAMs with splines. So they were using analytic methods. They didn't have the kind of gradient boosting methods that were invented 20, 30 years later. So they were using analytically fit splines. They believed in smoothness, that is, that the model should be as smooth as possible. And they also believed that you should use the minimum number of terms, the minimum number of features as possible to get adequate accuracy. That if a t-test didn't show this feature had to be in the data set, it shouldn't be in the model. And that's quite different from what we do now. If you think about it, these very smooth splines, they can't fit all this sort of detail that I was showing you, the rise in risk at 85, the drop in risk at 100, the rise in risk due to, they can't even fit the bump that happens right at 100 for dialysis. So splines are just too smooth. But now we have machine learning methods that are much more powerful at handling large number of features, large data sets, and doing gradient boosted things. And that's how we're getting all the extra accuracy. And then surprisingly, all these jumps, these step function rises that we see in the graphs really help anchor, really help us learn a lot more from the data. Smooth over those things the way splines would have done, would have just lost so much of but you got to give credit to the statisticians, right? They invented for exactly the reasons we're using it, for intelligibility. That's why they came up with this thing. And now we've just sort of got modern machine learning tricks making it perform better. And then to our surprise, those tricks are actually improve the intelligibility. We didn't know that that would happen. And now the models are more editable as well, because these graphs are more editable than the splines were.
Yes, you're right. And now let's get back to your work. Do you find
and by the way, sorry to interrupt. Let's be fair to statisticians. They didn't have the computing horsepower. They didn't have the massive data sets. They didn't have data sets with hundreds or thousands of features. They didn't have all the machine learning tricks. It really was a different world back in the late 80s than it is now. So they did an amazingly good job, actually, given what was available to them at the time.
Yeah, I completely agree. The computational power now is not comparable with what we have back then. And back to your work, do you find a bias from one hospital to another, or do you see it is we can generalize this well from one hospital to the next one?
It's a great question. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. It depends on a lot of factors. I would never just blindly take a model trained at one hospital system and then go apply it to another hospital system and just assume it's going to work. One of the nice things about the interpretable models is it's incredibly easy, if you have access to data from, say, 2 hospitals, to show the models side by side that you learn from the 2 different data sets. And that's because graphs are just incredibly easy for humans to compare. And in fact, we can even automate the comparison, which is, just show us the graphs that have the largest differences and we'll ignore the rest, for example. And then we can tell the models, we can allow them to pool resources if the graphs all look pretty similar. That is, we'll probably train a better model now that we have a larger data set that has 2 different stochastic properties in it from 2 different hospital systems. Or if necessary, we can say, we're going to let some of the graphs be learned jointly, but we're going to force certain graphs to be different. For example, I mean, if you've got data from a children's hospital and data from a hospital that serves everyone, mainly adults, then you want to be incredibly careful about what you would share between those 2 different hospital systems, because some conditions, cancer is going to be incredibly different in a children's hospital than it is in a hospital that's mainly old. So some things you have to be incredibly careful of, and yet other things do transfer incredibly well from hospital system to hospital.
Yes, again, back to your work, what translational work have you or your group done to get these technologies into clinical medical practice? And if you did that, what barriers do you encounter there?
We're having an interesting barrier, right? Like all of a sudden, the EBMs are relatively new as an open source package. They're only 2 years old. Although we've originally started doing this work about 10 years ago because of a problem I ran into in this pneumonia data set when I was a grad student in the 90s. That's what's motivated my interest in this. And one of the barriers we're finding right now, which is method that's used in PubMed papers, is table 1, which is a table of statistics, sometimes broken out in this age group, this age group, this age group. But table 1 is a standard thing in many PubMed papers, so much so that they call it table 1. And then if there's any sort of statistical fitting that's going on, it's almost always linear or logistic regression. And that's really tragic, because logistic regression, because it can't fit the nuances of the data, will often misrepresent what it's showing to you. It's not only that its accuracy will be lower, it's that when you try to learn from the logistic regression model, and telling you things that are not true about the data. If you think about it, a logistic regression model can't handle the fact that hypothermia is bad for you, a good temperature is for you, and then fever is bad for you. It can't go up, down, up. So then you'd have to create multiple features like a fever variable and a separate hypothermia variable. And we all know to do that for things like fever, to do this for. Never have guessed that we should do that for that both low and high lymphocytes were high risk. We would never have known that. The doctor didn't even believe it when we showed it to them. So logistics gloss over these things. It'll just draw like a kind of horizontal line through that high risk lymphocyte graph, and you won't even know that it's a signal you should be looking at, when in fact there's very important information there. The biggest problem we're having is not working with doctors. Doctors, once they see the model, they love the detail they see. They really become a believer very quickly. It's the journals. We're having problems getting reviewers to accept papers that use something as complex as a generalized additive model, because their standard practice is to use something much simpler, linear logistic regression. So we have a huge uphill battle as we try to change the community to hopefully please just stop using linear logistic regression, except in the few settings where it's exactly the right thing to do, but that's rare. And to start using some form of GAM or otherwise more interpretable, more complex model, so that you can really see what's going on. That's our biggest problem right now, actually, is reviewers of the medical journals.
Thank you. Question about future, maybe. Will interpretable ML incorporate missing value handling in the future? For example, calculating log odds for the missing value category? It's
a great question. And I encourage you, if you have missing values, to not impute them with the mean the way we saw was done in that one data set. Definitely, at a minimum, start by using them as a special value and let the model tell you what it would want to do. We are now working on a special way of handling missing values just for EBMs. and that open source tool in a month or so. And there's so much interesting stuff you can do with missing values once you have interpretable models like EBMs, that I gave a keynote presentation at a conference on missing values, just on what interpretability tells us about missing values. So there's actually all sorts of interesting things that you can do with respect to missing values. We've even seen weird data sets where it's a Boolean feature, yes or no. Then there's a value which is missing, expected that. And then there's another value which is value not available. And I don't know what the difference between missing is and value not available. But the worst thing is the telling us that there were huge differences in the risk for value not available versus value missing. And we still don't understand what in the data set is the difference between missing and value not available. But we know that for the model, it's incredibly important. So we know we have to figure it out before we go ahead and use that model clinically. So there's all sorts of fascinating stuff you see about missing values when you start doing interpretable models. I mean, once you got a pair of glasses, it's amazing what you start to see that's happening in data, things you would never expect.
Yes. And last question, I see a lot of questions about your research related to COVID-19, but just I pick one of them. Any explanation for the male sensitivity to COVID-19? Did you find anything specific?
You mean the high risk that we're seeing for COVID-19?
Yes,
the fact that,
high risk.
Yeah. So COVID-19, seems to be a respiratory illness, in some ways similar to other respiratory illnesses, yet in other ways different. But one of the things that's striking about it is it does seem like it's an like the risk is just 10 times or higher. That is, if the risk of an elderly patient with a certain number of comorbidities of dying from pneumonia would have been a 30% risk, or a 10% risk of dying from pneumonia, their risk from dying from COVID-19 might be 75%, which on a log-odd scale is a huge increase in risk. So we're just seeing that the risk of dying from COVID-19 is just much, much higher. And we don't know what the explanation for that is. It's amazing, like we take a lot of these factors that would be factors in other respiratory illnesses like pneumonia. Like, for example, men are higher risk at dying from pneumonia than women. That's been well understood for a long time. But the difference in risk there is kind of a 0.1 on a log scale, whereas the difference in risk for COVID-19 is like a 0.4. It's and a 4 times larger effect on a log scale is a big deal. Being elderly really does add a lot to risk in COVID-19, and we don't really understand why. It just seems to be that, I don't know, it seems to be that COVID-19, when it hits you very hard and fast from its higher risk, because it's more virulent. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be like you might believe, oh, well, maybe other respiratory illnesses only touch you on 3 or 4 factors that are high risk factors, and all the rest, isn't important. But maybe hits you on a dozen factors. It doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be that many of the factors that would be important in other respiratory illnesses are important in COVID-19, but possibly in slightly different ways. But they just seem to be a very amplified effect. It's really dramatic. The body's response. I mean, one of the ways of dying from COVID-19 is this cytokine storm. At least some people believe that. And the cytokine storm, essentially is your immune system has started to ramp up. It started to go to 60 miles per hour. Sorry, what's that, 100 kilometers? It started to ramp up, to get onto the highway and start fighting the illness. And then as it comes off the exit ramp onto the highway, it doesn't slow down. It then goes to 150 to 200 to 250 kilometers per hour. Suddenly the thing just keeps accelerating, and eventually, in those kinds of cases, it's actually it's the body's immune response, which actually hurts the patient, kills the patient, and starts killing organs in the patient. And it's not actually the COVID-19 itself, it's the fact that the body has responded in such an aggressive way and didn't know to stop, like to dial it back. It's really interesting. I mean, it's a great opportunity for machine learning because doctors don't have previous experience with this disease, and it's an incredibly aggressive, contagious disease, and even people can pass it who are asymptomatic. So that just makes it a really nasty thing from a social point of view. And doctors don't have any experience with it, so they're actually desperate for any sort of machine learning statistical methods to help them understand it as quickly as possible. And that's why hospitals in New York City gave us their data, of course, in a privacy preserving way. But they gave us their data very early on so that we could work closely with them. And we now, like, every other day to try to help them better understand what's happening in their patient population and what things work. Like, does this steroid actually work? If it does work, for what patients does it work? Is it harmful for some patients, helpful for other patients? Things like that. Everybody is still trying to figure out a number of these things. Things have gotten better, though. Mortality in hospitals, at least in the US, I believe, is down by at least a factor of 3 for equal risk patients. So hospitals are definitely learning a lot. If you're going to be sick with COVID-19, it's much better to be sick with it now than it would have been back in March and April, for example, when things really went bad in New York City. So.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sorry, that was such a long answer.
That was great. This has been a great talk. Thank you so much again. And thank you all for joining this talk. I hope that we see you again very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I've got active collaborations with people at University of Toronto, so that's great. And also feel free to contact me or my collaborators at Toronto, if you know them, to ask us questions, or if you want to use the model for something, we're happy to help. So.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening and sticking around for the long questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.